Today I'm going to show you how to create a procedural straw, a barbershop pole, and a bunch of abstract variations that came to mind while I was playing around with this setup. This actually all started when I came across one of Ryan King's tutorials, and I started thinking about, is there a simple way that I could create this spiral straw texture procedurally? Something that is fast to set up and quick and easy to change around. After I conquered the straw, I knew I could do anything, so I made this barbershop sign with the same general idea, and then I started making these abstract shapes here. Let's get back to this. I'm sure you've always wanted to be able to build a procedural barbershop sign, but just haven't known how up until this point. So don't worry, I will show you how you can achieve those dreams. It's probably easier than you think. Here's what the average node setup is going to look like. I'm also going to spend some time just kind of going over how I made a lot of these variations. It's actually why this tutorial took so long to release. Every time I thought I was done, I came up with something else that I thought was cool. I just felt like I had to render it out and show you. If you like these tutorials and you want to support them, you can check out my Patreon or Gumroad page. I have all my tutorial blend files up there, as well as some of my favorite scenes I've created over the years. Let's start off by creating a straw. I'm just going to delete this cube and bring in a cylinder. I'm going to set it to have 16 vertices rather than 32. And why don't we just go nothing for the top and bottom n-gons there, so it's got no top and bottom cap there. I'm going to hit N to open up this shelf on the right, and I'm going to punch in some dimensions here. You don't have to do exactly what I did, but this is just what I did for my straw. So 1.52 by 1.52 by 28.6. And that gave me kind of a straw dimension there. It's a pretty big straw. It's not really accurate to the physical world, but I just wanted the dimensions to be relative there. So then I'm going to move it up here. I'll just go Z. I'll just go 28.6 divided by 2. That'll just put my base right at the origin there. I'm going to hit Control A and apply that scale so that all of these scale numbers here are 1. I'll hit N to get rid of that shelf on the right and hit W or right click to open up this context menu. I'm just going to go Shade Smooth. I'm going to split the screen here and change the left side to my shader editor. Just put that material that was on our cube onto our straw shape there and hit N to get rid of that shelf on the right. Might as well get rid of this shelf on the left here with T. So my basic thought was, why don't I bring in a wave texture and try and distort it along some line to create some spiral pattern. I'm going to, over the 3D viewport, hold down Z and move my mouse up to go into rendered mode. And let's go ahead and get a preview of this wave texture by hitting Control Shift and left click. That's a Node Wrangler shortcut. So if it's not working, you just need to enable it in the preferences here. Just go to Add-ons, type in Node, and make sure there's a check mark right there. I'm going to change X to Z on my wave texture, and the scale, I'm going to change this to a much larger size here by lowering that number to 0.1. I'm going to hit Control T, which brings up my texture coordinate and mapping nodes, and I'm going to come out of Object instead of Generated. So I thought maybe I could just use a gradient node and just set it to radial. This actually worked pretty well, so set this to radial here. If we look at this, we can see that we've got a radial gradient going from 0 in this black area here, all the way around the object to 1 on the far side there, just as it rotates around 360 degrees. And we can actually plug this into the phase offset, and we can already see it kind of working a little bit here. It's just so slightly offsetting this pattern here. So I'm going to bring in a math node, place it right here, and change this to multiply. And let's set this to 6.3. That seemed to be the number that worked. 6.3 or any multiples of it seem to work just fine. So if you want to change some stuff on this wave texture, you can. It's not going to affect that offset. It's still going to line up nicely. You can also change this multiply, but I would just go times 2 or times 3 or something like that to get a steeper or less steep shape there. I'm going to bring in a map range node just after this wave texture to kind of shorten this gradient a little bit. So I'm going to bring up the from min to about 0.523 and the from max to 0.555. That just sharpens these lines here. Now there's not as much gray between this white and black. So then what we can do is plug this into a mix RGB. Just plug it into the factor. Then we've got two colors here that we can use to control the two colors on the straw. So let's say white for that top color, and then whatever we want for this bottom color is going to be our color on that straw. I'm going to plug this into the base color on the Principled BSDF, and let's take a look at that See what having a 28-meter tall straw kind of breaks down a little bit when we have the light interacting with it. So why don't I just switch to cycles, and I'll just go to GPU compute, and I'm going to put in an HDRI to help with this lighting a little bit here. So world properties, we're going to go to color, go to environment texture, go to open, navigate to where you got some HDRIs, and I've got some free ones from HDRI Haven or Polyhaven. And I'll just go with an interior shot there and go to ray visibility and unclick camera so it continues to light my scene, but it's not visible in the background anymore. I don't really need this light. Let's get rid of that. We could add a bit more complexity to the color of the straw as well. Maybe just go into a separate XYZ node, just out of object, and look at the Z. Unfortunately, it's negative something to 0 to positive something. So we could remap it if we wanted by going like this here, finding the bottom here, which looks like around negative 15, and go like positive 15 here. It's not as easy as just going from generated into this separate XYZ node though, because then it's just going to be 0 on the bottom and white on the top. So I'm going to feed this into a color amp here, and then we could plug this into the color here instead. So we get a gradient here. We could choose 2 colors, maybe go like green and something else, red. We bring green up a little bit. Or we could also go to HSL or HSV and choose near or far to get a color gradient there. So, clockwise or counterclockwise would also work, but this gives some pretty interesting results. Next, I made a barbershop sign, and since this is so similar, I'm just going to show you how I set this up. So basically, it's 2 of these setups on top of each other. Here's the mapping, the wave texture, the radial gradient, and this is an add right here, and that's used for animating this up and down. And then the multiply here, which is a multiple of 5.3, it's 12.6. And then I've just got my scale coming from this value node, 0.08 for both of them. And I've got one more add down here, set at 0.25, and that's just to offset this red from this blue. If I didn't have this, the red and blue would be mixed together. So I've got it set up like that. And then I've got 2 color amps here, just showing a narrow band. It's a little bit narrower than my first setup because this has to take up a little bit less room to make way for the other color there too. Just got a multiply mix node here, set to 1, and they're both feeding into there. I've got this value here set to frame over 100. So when I press play on my timeline, it just animates this property. So let's make that last shape, that abstract spinning shape there. And again, I'm just going to bring in a cylinder here, and I'll set it to 16 again for the amount of vertices. And let's just get rid of the n-gons at the ends. So I'll hit N to get rid of this, or to bring up this shelf rather. I'm going to change these dimensions to 3.17, 3.17, and 32.8. And then I'll just go 32.8 divided by 2 for this Z location there. Hit N to get rid of that shelf again. And let's go W and or right click and hit Shade Smooth. I'm going to put a material on this object and hit Shift A and search for our wave texture. Hit Control T and plug object into the vector there. Let's bring in a gradient node as well. Place it down here, plug object into that guy, change it to radial, and plug a math node at the end here, and change it to multiply, and we'll plug this into the phase offset. Let's change this to Z. We'll change the scale to something much smaller, something like 0.1. Also make sure to hit Control A and apply that scale on your object there so that it displays the texture correctly. I'm going to change this multiply to 6.3, and let's go ahead and add an add here as well so we can animate this property here, but for now we'll just leave it at 0. Just going to move this principled BSDF out of the way for now and bring in a map range node, and I'll just place it right after this wave texture here. I can bring these up a little bit here, but I'm actually going to plug something into these anyway, so won't really worry about those values for now. In fact, I'll just change them back to their defaults there, 0 and 1. I'm going to come out of generated and go into a separate XYZ. And this is going to come out of Z here and go into not a map range node, just a math node. And I'll place this here. It's going to be set to multiply. And I'm going to put another math node afterwards set to subtract. So basically this one here, I'm going to change this around, but I'll start it at 2 anyways. And this is going to go into the from max. and this subtract is going to go into the from min here. And let's look at this output here. Basically, the lines are the thickest up here and the thinnest down here. And if I change this subtract here to be much smaller, something like 0.004, then the effect is a little bit subtler. So if I move this back and forth, basically you can see these lines slowly moving up and everything black is getting thinner until it disappears. So this map range, I'm actually going to feed this into the alpha right here. So if we look at this, we can see now it's kind of this ribbon right here. If we move this subtract back and forth, we can see it goes up, but it also destroys that gradient. So I prefer to use this multiply here to move it back and forth. Then it keeps the gradient intact. To have a bit more control over this even, I'm going to add one more math node just before this multiply and just leave it on add, and I'll set it at 0. And so the relationship between the add and the multiply is nice here because we can set this add to a really high number if we want and then lower this multiply number. And we should see, I guess maybe we'll do it a little slower there. So we should see a more longer uniform size or width ribbon there if we move this add up and bring this multiply down. So we can exaggerate that more if we want to, bring it down to like 0.1 or something like that. And then bring this add up to something like 9 or 10. Yeah, so looks totally different there. So I'll just set this back to 0, and we'll bring this to 2 for now. So I'm just going to move these 4 nodes over a little bit here, and actually, let's move everything over. And I'm going to grab these 4 here, and I'll make an incision here as well, just before I split these off, because I'm going to go Control-Shift-D, duplicate all 4 of these nodes, so that they're all coming from the same spots that they were before. I'll feed this result into emission, so I can kind of see what is going on here. And I'm going to bring the add up to 2, and I'm going to bring the multiply down to 0.4. So now we can see we have this band of emission running through there. And the gradient is quite high right now. I'll change that as I go here, but I'm going to use this as displacement. So I'll feed this into the height on this displacement node. Then I'll just run this into the displacement on the material output. To get this displacement to work properly, we'll need to do 2 things. We'll first need to add a subdivision surface modifier, and I'll just leave it on Catalog Clark rather. I'll just turn it up to like 3 or 4 for now. And let's go down to the material settings here. And under settings here, go to displacement and change it from bump only to something other than that, displacement only or displacement and bump. And there we go. Looks perfect. To fix this here, let's go to the render properties? Yeah, there we go. And I'm going to change this. This was unsupported. Let's go to experimental so we can do adaptive subdivision. Then back to the modifiers panel and just click this checkbox here. And that basically allows it to subdivide it more if it's closer to camera and less if it's further away. And then change the scale on the displacement node to something lower. Try 0.1 there. And then let's also soften that gradient with this subtract node here. Maybe just raise it up to like 0.04 instead. Let's see what that looks like. So that looks much better there, much softer, rather than just going from white to black right away. It's now got a bit of a gradient there. So I'm going to unplug this node from emission there, and we could even do like maybe a bump node as well, just for a simple bump map. Plug this result into the height there, and then plug it into the normal there. Now we'll have that bump and displacement controlled by the same setup. I'm going to bring my metallic to 1. And let's go ahead and bring in an ambient occlusion node just to kind of highlight this area right here in the middle. And let's come out of ambient occlusion, and I'll go into a color ramp, and I'll bring the black to 0.8, quite high. And then this white, I'll bring it down to 0.92 or so, somewhere around there. And let's plug this into the color on this guy. And then let's bring the roughness down to something like 0.1, maybe 0.2. I'm going to plug this map range back into emission just so I can see that middle part a bit better. And I'm just going to adjust some stuff on this bottom line here with the add, multiply, and subtract. I'm going to change the multiply to 0.45 just kind of raise that up a bit. And so this is a thinner band in the middle now. And let's change this top multiply to something slightly lower, or no, slightly higher, pardon me. I'll go to 3.2 for this guy. That actually looks pretty cool with the emission there. I might just leave that. We can always change the emission color if we want, and the emission strength as well. I'm going to make an incision right here, just to make readability a bit better. This is done by just holding down Shift and right-clicking and dragging through those noodles there. And I'm going to add one more multiply node just right here before this crossroads. And I'll set this to 1. And this is going to be helpful if I want to kind of move it across the area there. I find the multiply works pretty well. It does get thicker on the bottom as it goes along, so you could use an add or whatever to offset that, but I'm just going to use a multiply here for now. So we'll leave that at 1 for now. I'm going to hit R, Y, and 90 and then enter to rotate this 90 degrees on the Y-axis. And I did that in object mode and didn't apply this rotation because if I did, I'd need to change stuff like this separate XYZ and the wave texture setting here as well. So I'm not going to worry about that. I'm going to animate it on this add node here right after the gradient texture. I'm going to go here and go keyframe or hashtag frame divided by 1000. So if I press play here, we can see, maybe I'll do it in material preview mode so it doesn't take so long. You can press play here, and just see it's moving pretty slowly. We can speed that up if we want. Maybe let's go to like 500 and just see what that looks like. It's still kind of slow actually. I think I just did it slightly different settings last time, so let's play around with this. Just find a speed that you like. I find the slower tends to look more powerful and larger sometimes. So if you're going too fast, the effect is kind of lost. So I try to err on the side of caution as far as that's concerned. 100 looks pretty good. I like the look of that. I'm going to duplicate this here with Shift D. And let's go ahead and hit N to bring up this panel here. Instead of 3.09, I'm going to go something like 4.5 for each of these here. So it's just a wider shape there. And I'm going to create a new material by clicking this icon right here, and I'll bring in another math node right after this add here, and I'll change it to multiply and just put -1 in here. And this is going to allow it to spin the opposite way as that first one. So when you press play now, they should be spinning opposite ways. Maybe I'll grab that inner cylinder there, and let's go ahead and put a color ramp right before the emission right here. And we can change the color. So we could go maybe something like bluish or greenish, maybe just a slight blue tint there. And maybe for that other one, let's do another color change. Just place it there. And I should really spread these out so we can still see what's going on. There we go. Let's change this to something like slightly orange. We could bump up the emission strength if we want as well. It's up to you. This looks pretty interesting. What I had originally is no emission here on either one of these and just kind of the metal shape there. But it's totally up to you. And if you want to move this across, you can either just move this multiply right here or the multiply and the add, whatever you think is going to look cool. Let's try setting something up a little bit more similar to my original project there. You have the inner cylinder there, and just unplug the emission for now. And I don't really even think I need the subdivision surface on there. It's just going to take more time to render everything. So I'll just leave the bump there, but I'll get rid of the displacement. The bump is just behind there, and I'll get rid of that color ramp. It's not doing anything anymore. So let's grab this outer cylinder and do something similar. I'll just unplug the emission there, get rid of that color ramp. Let's drag it down here. I don't need to get rid of it. And this displacement here, we'll leave it on. Maybe we'll turn down the bump. 0.2 is probably a little bit better than 1. On that inner cylinder again, I'm going to change this multiply right here. The one I set to 6.3. I'm going to change that to times 2, so 12.6. And let's change this add up here to something a little higher, something like 2. And this multiply to something much lower, something like 0.3. And maybe I'll just kind of ease this off a little bit just by bringing it up 2.35 looks pretty good. So now it's basically reaching the end right here where it gets super skinny, and it's a little bit longer this way. It's not wrapping around so many times. Let's grab this outer one here and do something similar. I'll do times 2 again for this 6.3, so 12.6 there. And let's do something like 2 and 0.3 or 0.2. Yeah, and maybe what we could do is just animate this one right here. So start it off at the beginning of the frame, or at the beginning of the animation, frame 1 at like maybe around 3. So just keyframe that. And I'm going to go to the end. Did I keyframe that at, yeah, I keyframe that at 7. So move it to 1. And then I'll go to the very end at 250, and maybe let's go something like 2.38, and I'll just keyframe it there. And actually, I don't even really want it at the end. I'll put it at like frame 100, and then maybe 160, and then I'll grab that original keyframe and just move it to the end. I noticed when I rendered this out that the displaced part, or in this case, because I have the inner cylinder, it's just the bump map part, but it doesn't quite come to the end. So let's plug this map range back into the emission so we can kind of see that and compensate for that as well down here. So I'm just going to lower this multiply value to maybe like 0.2. Then let's bring up this add here and just find a level that we like. I like this level here, like 100 for the add and 0.01 for the multiply. I think that looks pretty good. It goes all the way to the end. Maybe I'll bring this multiply up a little higher, like 400 or something. No, that's way too high. Maybe 102.5. I'll just unplug this and do the same thing with that outer cylinder as well. As it moves along, I guess I have to animate it, so I should probably do that. The beginning level it should be fine, but let's plug this into the emission there. And let's adjust this a little bit. Okay, so I ended up setting the add to 50 and the multiply to 0.021. And then let's go to that first keyframe there, which is at, well, I guess the first one's at 1, but the second one's at 100 there. So I'll go there. And let's animate this add right here. Just bring this to the end. 49.5 or so. Yeah, that looks good. Let's keyframe that. And I just realized I didn't do the first one, so let's keyframe that as well. What was it, 50? I think it was 50. I made this variation here. It's got this generated output leading to the separate XYZ coming out of Z there and going into a noise texture. And then I've just got an add and a multiply here that just basically adds it to this existing displacement I have from this map range. And yeah, so that just kind of, you can see if I unplug this, it's just a cylinder again, but if I plug this in, it's just kind of varied and looks like a ribbon. This next variation is the same thing, but I've just got this map range going into a color ramp. And I changed the white to a different color, in this case blue, and fed it into the emission there. So now it's kind of a glowing object there. I also put that metal bar in the middle just for some reflections. Then I made this variation here, which has that generated output going to the separate XYZ. From the Z, I fed it into another noise texture, and then a multiply just to kind of control the magnitude of everything. And I fed that into the scale on this wave texture. So it gave me kind of an increased frequency, but also these interesting shapes here where it kind of changes direction. I also made this variation here, which has some transparency, and it also has a color gradient going along this direction here. And I did that by going from the generated to a separate XYZ. So that just kind of gives me this pattern here, dark to white there. And I just fed it into a color ramp, which I probably didn't need to do. I guess it was already like that. I just multiplied it by this ambient occlusion node and put a color ramp after that that just has a color gradient going from some color to white. And I've got it on HSV and far. So that's plugged into the base color on the principled BSDF. Then I just put the transmission at 1. This next variation actually has 2 pieces there, 2 cylinders at once. And this blue one just kind of moves across and isn't anchored as much. And I achieved that just by attaching these 2 color amps here to this top chain with the generated output, the separate XYZ, and from the Z into an add and multiply. 2 color amps that look like this with white on the top and bottom and 2 black flags somewhere in the middle there. This one's pretty similar to the last one, except this time I have 3 cylinders there. And we've got the red, the blue, and then this yellow one here, which is actually broken up into 2 pieces. And so the way I made that is I just made a color ramp here that has 2 black sections there. So this is the first one here. This is the second one here, marked by these 2 sections here for the yellow. For this variation, I just made 2 identical cylinders and rotated the second one a little bit along this axis here. This next variation looks really cool when viewed from the side. I mean, they all kind of do, but this one especially, I thought. And the way I got this was just setting this multiply right here. This was set pretty low before. I set it to 189, and you can just see what happens when you turn that up. I'll just bring it way down. So, yeah, here's what it was. For those earlier ones, something like 15, maybe 30, 189. Just turns it in kind of like a wire frame almost in the end. Looks really neat. This last one is pretty similar to the last example. The difference is I've got 2 cylinders this time, and the second one, well, here's the first one. It's set to 1 and 189. The second one is set to -1 and 189, which just changes the direction, and it's also displaced slightly less. So on the bottom here, we've got this multiply here set to 74, and the other one is set to 76.4. So a little bit more displacement on that second cylinder. If you make something and you're finding that the reflections aren't quite working with the light, check out these settings under Render Properties and Light Paths. You can set the max bounces to a higher number, and it might improve the way that the light is in your scene. So that's it for today. Hope you could follow along and see what I was doing. If you have any questions about any of the setups, you can ask me here, or if you want them all, you can just buy them on my Gumroad or find them on Patreon as a supporter. Thanks for watching.